Lord Hague, William Hague, just before we start, we've just been told that the Archbishop of Canterbury has resigned. He's just put out a statement saying he is going to step down. Can you just give us your reaction to that?
I'm sad, actually, because I think he's a good man. I think he's a decent and very intelligent man. So I'm very sad to see him go. It's completely understandable, of course, because he's under the huge pressure and criticism of this shocking chain of events. So I'm sad for him personally that what's been in many respects a very distinguished time as Archbishop of Canterbury is ending this way. The critical thing is going to be, is the church able to deal with things like this in the future? Has the culture in the church changed sufficiently from what he's done over the last few years or what any successor can do? So to make it much less likely that such abuse and scandals can happen in the future. So that's really the big question when you separate it from the fate of individuals. But as an individual who I like and respect, I'm very sorry personally for him.
As an institution, has the Church of England done enough to reconstitute itself for the modern world? Well,
probably not. I mean, it's difficult for churches to keep up with the changes of society and the changed expectations of society. But something like this, where people have been systematically and repeatedly abused over a long time, and where clearly some people knew about it for some time, that's not even a changed expectation. They should always have been able to deal with that. And as I said, that is going to be the totally critical thing for any new archbishop to be able to say to the country, you can have confidence in the church, that we have the right culture, that whatever your religious beliefs or not, that these sorts of things won't happen on our watch anymore. So I don't think we can be, given the controversy in the church and the resignation of the archbishop, we can't be confident that is yet the case. It will need to be the case in the coming months under any successor.
Mm. You say you're sad that he's gone, but were you surprised, or do you feel it was inevitable?
Well, perhaps not surprised in the end. We've seen the way these things develop with so many political resignations over the years. That people try to stay in office, and then it overwhelms them that they can't do any of the rest of their work, that the controversy isn't going to go away. So I suppose I'm not surprised.
William Hague, Lord Hague, welcome to the Daily Tea. We always like to do first, how would you like us to refer to you? Lord Hague, William?
I think William is, now you've said Lord Hague once, that's entirely enough for me.
Excellent.
So William is fine. Not Bill, not Will, but William will be good.
William it is. Glad to get that said. We always ask all our guests, how do you take your tea? The teapot is here, ready and waiting.
I don't really take tea. I know I'm from Yorkshire, and but I don't. I will, out of politeness, sip it.
No, you don't have to. No.
But basically, I just drink water, red wine, and black coffee. And that is, and I feel good on that combination.
I think you and I should start a movement, actually, because as Kamal knows, I also don't drink tea. I also am a black coffee person, and I think it's high time that we, at the very least, offered a cafetiere rather than just a teapot.
Yes. There you go. Okay.
The daily cafetiere.
If you ever want me to come again, I will be expecting that. That sort of treatment.
There you go.
I won't ask you who you'd like to take a cup of tea with, though, but I will ask you, alive or dead, maybe a glass of red wine, who would you love to have a glass of red wine with? Now, alive or dead, as we say, but it can't be a member of your family because that's too easy.
Well, William Pitt the Younger, because I spent years of my life trying to get to know him, even though he died in 1806. I wrote a book about him and another book about William Wilberforce. But in his case, it would be port. Of course, that would be a glass of port, because he was at war with France. A lot of the time he was Prime Minister. You actually couldn't get much red wine. You couldn't get claret when you were at war with France. This is one of the reasons British people drank a lot of port. You could get the port wine from Portugal, and he famously drank 3 bottles a day of that, although port wasn't quite as strong in those days as it is today. But to sit, I often think, having spent several years writing about his life and what he was like, what a great thing it would be to ever be able to talk to him. It will never be possible, but that's who I would choose, alive or dead.
And why?
Because he's a towering figure in our history who's been underappreciated. So because he died in the middle of a war, if you're a war leader, never die in the middle of the war, because you never get the thanks for the end of it. That Britain won the Battle of Waterloo and so on at the end of it. So we think of our war leaders through history, Churchill and Lloyd George and so on, and then miss out Pitt the Younger because he died young. But he was an immense figure in our history, and the first truly modern prime minister who used the power of the Treasury to control all the other departments, which is now a very familiar thing in British government. But he was the first one, really, to do it. If you were in charge of the money, you actually could tell them all what to do. And also was the origin of the modern Tory party, and that he stood for free trade and national identity and strong defences. There were attitudes there that gave birth to the Conservative Party. So for all these reasons, I would love to spend time with him.
Given that he could manage 3 bottles of port a day, I think you once boasted, didn't you, William, that you managed 14 pints a day. So you'd probably give him a run for your money.
Oh, I would give him a run for it. Yeah, well, that would kill me now, of course, as would 3 bottles of port or 3 bottles of anything. So I'm not going to attempt that.
Good. So you're here predominantly because you're running for the chancellorship of Oxford University. What exactly is that job? And can we vote for who gets it?
Well, you can vote if you're Oxford graduates and you registered to vote 3 months ago.
Gordon, did you do are you either of those things?
Yes to the first, no to the second.
Excellent. I'm neither of those things, so sadly I can't vote.
Yeah, I think probably the great majority of graduates did not register. They didn't.
I had no idea.
They didn't spot that email, or their university didn't have their email address. About 26,000 graduates, alumni, have registered to vote. Plus, there's 5,000 or 6,000 people who are in what's called the congregation, who are the faculty in Oxford. They get to vote as well. So the electorate for this is a little over 30,000 people. And they've had one vote already 2 weeks ago, which narrowed the field down from 38 candidates to 5 candidates,
like
of whom, no, it's even more complicated than the Tory leadership and even harder to work out what the result might be. And now there are 5 candidates, of whom I am one, and the voting is all through next week. So around 2 weeks from now, we will have a result from that. But good question. What is the job? It is the head of the university. But the job is not actually to run the university, because thankfully there's a vice chancellor, and that's really the chief executive of the university. But the chancellor presides at major ceremonies, and in the modern world is also somebody who's very involved in fundraising for the university and who expresses the values of the university, and is a source of private advice and counsel to the vice-chancellor and other leading figures in the university. So a bit of a guiding spirit of the university, but not day-to-day, deciding on admissions policies or salaries, or it's not the job to run it. And it's not a political job. It's often been done by politicians, but it needs to be done in a very cross-party way.
So why do you want to do it?
Well, I want to do it because Oxford transformed my own life. I came from a comprehensive school in South Yorkshire. I didn't know anybody in Oxford when I arrived. No one in my family had ever been to university. And well, look at me now. Look at.
Now you're on the Daily Telegraph.
Yes, the dizzy heights, the dizzy heights of the Daily Telegraph podcast, and but a long career in government and many other things, the writing that I've done, and so on. And I feel like Oxford enabled me to do that. So of course, I now 63 years old. I think I'm in a good position to give back in that hackneyed phrase, but because this is an unpaid position. It's not. It's something you do voluntarily. It's something you take out of your other time. And but I'm now in a position to do that, and I've remained involved in Oxford. It's not like going back after 40 years. I was actually very heavily involved in the first development campaign for Oxford. When Oxford was running out of money in the late 80s, and I was a young management consultant, it was me who advised them how to raise money that they had to start communicating with all their alumni. I stood in front of all the heads of colleges and persuaded them to spend their last reserves to raise hundreds of millions of pounds, which they then went on to do. So I have been involved that, and being a fellow of my college. I go back every year to teach a seminar or a class or give a lecture on history or politics. So I've retained a strong involvement with Oxford, and I think that puts me in a good position to help communicate to the whole country and the world what Oxford is and what it is about and how crucial it is to the future of this country, which I think it is. So all of these things motivate me to stand for Chancellor. I don't like standing in another election, really. I never wanted to stand in another election in my life. I've had enough of elections. But this is something that...
You've lost a few as well, William.
I've won a few. I lost a big one, the general election in 2001. But I was elected 6 times in my constituency in Yorkshire, so I'm used to winning them as well. So for all these reasons, I'm very motivated to do it. It's not the sort of thing you want to be desperate to do. It's something you're prepared to do. But I'm definitely prepared to do it.
You said it's not a political role. Peter Mandelson, Lord Mandelson, Labour royalty, has said it's about time a Chancellor of Oxford wasn't broadly a white male Conservative. He suggested that maybe it could even be a Labour Chancellor, and given that Lord Mandelson is standing against you, very useful for him to have said that. How do you respond to Lord Mandelson's, as ever, slightly barbed comments, which could be construed as a bit of an attack on you? Because I think you two are seen as at least the front runners.
Yeah, by the way, no one knows who the front runners are. There are 5 candidates, and no one should presume that they are the first or the second. We'll find out in a couple of weeks. But there can be surprises in this sort of election, just as there are surprises in American presidential elections and everything else. So I wouldn't presume that. But what I would say to that is it's not a political job. It's very important to do it in a cross-party way. So there's no such thing as a Labour Chancellor or a Tory Chancellor. There are chancellors who work for the university with people of all political persuasions, and that's how the great chancellors have always done it. They've by no means always been conservative. The one who's just stepped down, Chris Patten, is a conservative, but before him was Roy Jenkins, who was, of course, a great figure in the Labour Party for decades, and was a Labour Home Secretary and a Labour Chancellor, although he subsequently led the Social Democratic Party. So it's actually a bit of a it's a caricature to think it's always been held by Tories. It's varied over the decades. It's very often been a political figure, that is true. Someone who came out of politics, someone who could be apolitical in doing the job. And that's because it does benefit from having somebody with some global reach. You need to know those philanthropists in America who might give. You need to know how government works. You need to be able to go along to the House of Lords if necessary and move an amendment defending academic freedom or freedom of speech. So you do need, it tends to be done by somebody who has the seniority to do that. And that's one of the reasons Peter Mandelson and I are standing for it.
Mm. Do you think the students who are undergraduates certainly actually care about who does the job? Does it make any difference to them? There was an interesting comment in one of the Sunday papers from a chap called Gaurav, who is at Magdalen College. I think that was where you went. Mm-hmm. And he said, they've taken fridges out of some of the rooms in college, which is just very unfair. It doesn't really affect you, whoever is Chancellor.
Well, it is true that it will not affect whether the fridge is in the room. Although they should have a fridge if they're meant to have a fridge. But that is not something the Chancellor will be able to sort out. Now, of course, this is a longer term thing. It is, as I've stressed, not the person who runs the university. But does it matter to future students if the university can raise billions of pounds more in endowment that help people have access, so you can then help people, irrespective of background, be able to come to Oxford? Well, that matters a lot, not to that student wondering about the fridge today, but to the student in 5 years' time who can't afford to go to Oxford but needs that grant, that scholarship. Well, that's where the choice of Chancellor makes a big difference, because, as I said, fundraising is part of the role and part of what I've done for Oxford for for decades, is that. So I think you make a difference in that sense. By the way, I've just literally just come from Oxford with a group of students in Magdalen College, from the Blavatnik School of Government, from the Said Business School, and from other institutions in Oxford. A great group of students, all very engaged in what the next chancellor is going to do and who it ought to be. So,
sure
there will be, like in any group of people, just like in a general election, there are some people who don't feel engaged by it and others who really do.
Let's go through some of the issues in higher education which affect Oxford, but obviously all universities in the United Kingdom. One of the first things the Labour government did when it won the election was abandon plans introduced by the previous Conservative government for legislation to promote free speech or face sanctions by a regulator, including possible fines, in the university sector. So the Conservatives had said free speech is under threat. You've mentioned free speech a couple of times already in some of our conversation. Is under threat. We need to have legislation to strengthen the defence of free speech in universities. Bridget Phillipson, the Education Secretary, has come in and said that's unnecessary. All the correct regulations are already in place. What do you think of that decision? Does it need more legislation? Should that legislation come back?
Yes, it should. I think that was good legislation. And I'm very sorry the new government so far have decided not to proceed with it. I mean, they've put it on pause. They haven't actually repealed it. They haven't really they haven't won the democratic authority to do that. They've not put it to Parliament. Of course, they can easily win a vote in Parliament because there are so many Labour MPs. But Parliament enacted that law. And now ministers are just deciding not to implement it. So they should at least be going back and debating it in Parliament. And I hope they will reconsider, because this is very important. This has got to be one of the great values of British universities, freedom of speech, even if you're listening to things that make you uncomfortable. That is I cut my teeth debating in the Oxford Union for many years, constantly listening to things I completely disagreed with. Well, what a great preparation that was for 26 years in the House of Commons, where that's what I had to do. But that's how you learn. That is how you adjust to somebody else's opinion, having some legitimacy, rather than cancel culture, rather than saying whatever makes you uncomfortable, you are never going to listen to it. So within the law, within our legal framework, and of course the law does outlaw various types of discrimination and anti-Semitism and racism, quite rightly. But within the law, we should have free speech. And students should be exposed to many different and varied points of view. So I think it is important, since there have been some well-known problems and issues such as over Kathleen Stock. It is really important to entrench that. And that's one of the values of a university that I would hope to express as Chancellor.
What do you say to students who say that means that they not just hear things, but it is distressing to hear arguments which they find discriminatory, and this argument about what is described as safe spaces, that university shouldn't be a space where I'm worried that I'm going to have my values insulted? I'm just channeling what students might say to you. Whether I agree or disagree with that position, I think is not for now. But lots of students, maybe to Gordon and me, may seem, too delicate. It might seem to us, we're, similar generation. It might seem to us, well, don't be so ridiculous and so delicate about issues. But if students are demanding that they have spaces where they don't hear things which they find mentally distressing, well, you should give them that right.
Well, first of all, I think the vast majority of students aren't saying that. Again, the students I've been to a lot of meetings and question and answer sessions with students in Oxford over the last few weeks, and they really enjoy a good vigorous debate, and they're not, they don't look fragile at the end of it. So, but of course you are right. Some people put the point of view that you are just describing. And my answer to that is the world out there is not going to be a safe space. We're clearly going into a period in the history of the world, a new period of history, which is very, very exciting about what could be achieved in science and technology. But it's very, very dangerous in what can happen in conflict, and both within societies and global conflict. We have several major wars going on in the world now. So there's no point preparing for the world as a safe space. It is one in which new ideas will come up rapidly, in which they have to be debated vigorously, in which we have to have a critical approach to our own thinking and that of other people. So it's better to prepare for that, because that is the world you're going into. So I don't really go along with the safe space thinking. The world people are entering, the world of work and society they're about to enter, is definitely not going to be a safe space.
One of the other big controversies at Oxford over the last few years has been around statues and around removing statues. There was the whole debate about the Cecil Rhodes statue, which a lot of students felt was associated with colonialism, and therefore they wanted it taken down. Is it ever right to remove statues or paintings or historic objects that have links to things like colonialism and slavery, or not? And what would you have said if you'd been Chancellor when the Rhodes Must Fall campaign was happening?
Well, on the whole, I'm a great enthusiast for history and learning from history, but of understanding that you have to understand people in their historical context, that they were living in a different time, when attitudes were different. And that does not mean that they didn't do any good at all, just because we disagree with them today. Just as there will be people in even 30 years from now who look upon us as very backward people. They will, whatever it may be, how could they treat animals in that way? Or how did they, my own particular passion of nature and wildlife, how did they allow nearly 3/4 of the world's wildlife to be extinguished in 50 years? And people have found that extraordinary, that we were so ignorant and so backward in the early 21st century that we did that. But that doesn't mean none of us are doing any good or doing the right thing. So you have to see people in their historical context, which means on the whole not tearing down the past. It's learning from it, but not pulling down the statues. Now, one can't be absolutist about this, because, what would we think if there was, if you went around in Germany and there were statues of Hitler all over the place? You'd say, no, better to take those down. So, of course, this is not an absolute. It always requires some judgment. But the judgment, you should err on the side of understanding history, not denying history. That is, I err on that side.
So for you, as you say, in the UK, the discussion has been much more nuanced, because there wasn't a Hitler figure, a Mussolini figure, a Stalin figure, but there was Cecil Rhodes. So to Gordon's point, specifically on that issue, should the statue of Cecil Rhodes have been removed? No.
Again, I err on the side of understand history, understand what people did positively in the context of their times.
Do you think students get value for money? The teaching hours vary. History students get 8 to 9 hours a week. Medicine and dentistry students get over 35 hours of sort of contact time a week. Student loan company says graduates in England leave university with average debts of nearly £45,000. Is it worth it?
It still is worth it on the whole. Of course, it depends what you do with your life afterwards, and it partly depends what you qualify in, what you study. On the whole, it is worth it if you look at the incomes and the life of people who go to university. On the whole, they certainly have a more prosperous existence than others. So it is on the whole, on average, worth it. And it's certainly worth it in the case of Oxford, because there is a lot of personal tuition. A distinctive thing about Oxford is the tutorial system. That means there is a high ratio of teaching staff to students, and people really have a closer intellectual relationship with their tutor than is the case in many universities. That's a very important thing to preserve for the future. And actually, I think in this age of mounting mental health problems for young people, that sort of personal link and living within a college community, which is not such an impersonal thing as a vast university, these are really important strengths of Oxford that come from its past. But of course, yes, one can debate the value of different degrees around the country, around different universities. People have to be, they have to try and choose the right thing, where they've got a real passion for it, where they love doing it, and where they will really excel in it. And then they will do well in life.
Yeah, and you say that on the whole, it's worth it. I think that's an interesting phrase that you just used. Your fellow Conservative, Kemi Badenoch, has said student numbers need to come down. She says there's just too many students. I think when Tony Blair came into power, there were 1.7 million people in higher education. There's now nearly 3 million. Is Kemi Badenoch right? Are there just too many students now?
No, I'm really not sure about that. I probably disagree with her about that. That's not to say they're all studying the right things now, or that's why I use the phrase "on the whole." It's worth it. But again, look at the world we're going into the next 10, 20, 30 years, as far as we can see into the future, and this extraordinary period of change of artificial intelligence. Really changing the way all other technologies work, or the way every job is going to work, probably the whole way education works. So it's very hard to foresee the results. But part of that is going to be learning to work with artificial intelligence. Certainly it is going to be about enhancing human capital, of human brains being trained as well as possible to work with all these pressures and opportunities of new forms of intelligence. And I would have thought on the whole that means more young people go into higher education in 20 years' time than today. So I tend to that side of the argument. It's predicated a little bit on this vision of the future that is hard to substantiate, but big change is coming. And you want a more educated, not less educated population if you're going to be at the forefront of that change, is my instinct.
Are all the degrees within the university system of equal value? People say Mickey Mouse degrees are the problem, that some students are going to university to study for qualifications that aren't worth the huge amounts of debts they take on. I don't think anyone's saying that of Oxford, but certainly of other places.
Yeah.
Are Mickey Mouse degrees a problem within your overall envelope that you think should be expanding in higher education?
Well, it's always hard to put your finger, I think, on what those are, these Mickey Mouse degrees. There definitely will be degrees that are much less value than others in terms of future earning capacity. But remember, people are also experiencing the benefits of going to university, of meeting new people, hopefully of hearing different points of view in the way we were just discussing. And so it's not just an academic, you can't just measure universities on their academic prowess. And I don't think that is an Oxford problem. I think I think Oxford gives a great education to people. And then I think a lot of it is not the degree that is taken, it's what you do with that afterwards. Because then you have to turn up at a place of work and really show willing. And, you can have the best degree in the world. And if you don't do that, well, then you're not going to get on very well. But if you really say, well, I am going to show up at that office and I'm going to help out with everything, well, within 3 years, you've got lots of responsibility. And you can have a degree in totally the wrong thing and it won't matter at all.
Yeah.
So it's what you make of it afterwards. Having a highly motivated and healthy workforce is actually the key thing, rather than worrying that much about exactly what did they study at university.
I'm interested in knowing what you think about international students. So the last government banned most international students from bringing family members to live with them in the UK. There were 16% fewer international students applying for visas this year. University leaders are starting to fret a little bit about how much income they're going to get now because of the obviously foreign students pay higher fees. But has it been a mistake for universities to rely so much on income from foreign students?
Well, you can't blame them for doing that when their income has been constrained in other ways. They've had tuition fees, but then frozen over the last 10 years or so. And now the new government has announced those are going up with inflation to try to alleviate this problem.
Do you agree with that they should have done that? Increase tuition fees?
I think it's inevitable. I think really whoever has won the election, but I'm not going to criticize that. I think, though, what needs to go with that is either maintenance grants or improved loans or improved scholarships. In the case of Oxford, there's a great scheme, the Crank Start scholarships, and 17% of all the UK undergraduates at Oxford benefit from that. which helps access to higher education from people who might struggle financially otherwise. And if tuition fees are going to keep rising, I can see we will need more of that. And I think part of the job is back to this fundraising role of a chancellor. Part of the job of a future chancellor is to make sure there's enough endowment for the university and for scholarships like that, that you can always be open to people irrespective of background. That is a really, just like free speech is a key value of the university system, in my view, so is access to it irrespective of background. So I agree with it, but it should have all those things going with it. The increase in tuition fees. And really here what we need is a longer term understanding between universities and government. Because what you're pointing to, the questions about overseas students and then about tuition fees is how do universities cope with all these changes of government policy under different parties, even if they're each justified in themselves. And in Australia, they've just been working on, and I think agreed in principle, a future compact between the university sector and government, which they hope to carry on across successive governments. So they are looking 20 years ahead at what proportion of the country will go to university, what will be the composition of the funding for that over a long time. If we could achieve that, that would be very beneficial to the university sector.
It sounds like you're saying there should be more foreign students.
No, that's part of the mix. I mean, you have to choose between, you either have more foreign students or you have more state funding of some sort, or much higher fees. But then you have to, how are you going to maintain that access to people who don't come from a well-off financial background? And we can work on that at Oxford, but governments have to address those questions. And I think one of the helpful things here would be to explain. And again, I see this as a key role of, if I was elected Chancellor of Oxford, is to explain what universities are providing to the country. Because all the debate is about what universities need. Do they need more support? Like universities are passing the begging bowl around. But in my view, what happens in Oxford in the next decade is critical to the future of the UK. And people glimpsed that in COVID when, wasn't it really convenient that Oxford could produce a vaccine very quickly? Well, it could only do that because it had 20 years of vast knowledge and research on vaccines. And what people aren't really aware of is what all the other things now going on in a place like Oxford, quantum encryption and nuclear fusion and biologically sourced materials that will replace plastic, might do in the future. And these will be to create wealth and opportunity and be at the forefront of technology in Britain. A place like Oxford is critical to the future, and Cambridge and Imperial and other great universities. So I think we have to turn this debate around a bit. Instead of the newspaper headlines always being what universities need in money, let's have an understanding of what universities are going to contribute. Which is vast. Do
you think they're undervalued at the moment in the UK?
Well, I think they are a bit, yes. And I think people sometimes see Oxford as an ivory tower and this remote place. But it's not remote when you need that COVID vaccine. That really does touch everybody's lives and the whole economy, just in that one example. And so I think they are, and I think what I would like to do, the Chancellor's role has changed so much over 800 years, not surprisingly. And until very recently, it had become very much a ceremonial role. Chris Patten has been much more involved, doing dozens of events around the university in the course of a year as the Chancellor, and I would certainly want to continue with that. But there's an additional role, which is to explain, to use modern media, to do podcasts and to explain universities to the rest of the country and how critical they are in an age of rapid change, of unprecedented change, which we are now going into as a human civilization.
One of the criticisms that people always have of this country, really, is that we're very poor at turning the great ideas and inventions that come out of the universities into commercial success.
Yes.
And we come up with great ideas, and then another country puts the money up to turn it into a commercial success. What could you do? What can be done to change that?
Well, that's there are positive things happening. Oxford is the top university in the country for successful spin-outs, for great ideas then being spun out as successful companies. And there's something that was welcome in the budget was a bit more funding from Rachel Reeves to support that kind of work. So I think that's a really top priority to do more of that. But then that next stage, after you've spun them out, is how do they grow into the multi-billion-dollar international company? That's when they always get bought by an American or other company. That is, well, let's hope this week we will see, we'll hear Rachel Reeves' speech at the Mansion House, I think, on Thursday, which is about how the pension fund capital in this country is deployed. I hope she will build on and turbocharge what Jeremy Hunt started on that, because we're not good at risk capital in Britain. We've got hundreds of millions of pounds hundreds of billions of pounds that we all own in one way or another in pension funds. And yet it's largely not invested in British business. And you wouldn't want to invest all of it in risky things, but more of it should be. And I hope she will pursue those, she will intensify those reforms the last government started that might release more of that capital.
So incentivise pension funds to invest some of the money they hold in Britain, and then you think that might in itself solve this problem of universities not being able to turn ideas into business success?
Well, it's a big part of it, because we're not short of savings in this country, but we are short of deploying them into something that's a bit risky. Whereas in America, you can get the risk capital. And what's the answer to that? Well, it's to have a big portfolio. And of course, you only ever risk a small part of it. But if you don't have the risky bit, you don't have the high returns either. You miss out on the upside if you don't take risk. And so our financial system needs adjusting for that. And this would make a huge difference. The other thing, of course, is to have an environment in the country in which people can build a business that is very innovative and is bound to be a bit risky to begin with, which needs fast-moving regulators. And again, there's some promising signs from the new government, but I hope they will really push this much further. They've announced a regulatory innovation office to make regulators move, more quickly.
A regulator for regulators.
Yes.
Is that going to help us?
I know. Well, it could, because again, there's so many new scientific ideas, new ways of producing food, all these new kinds of artificial intelligence. But you have to license them quickly, otherwise these people will set up their production plants in America or China or wherever else in the world. So fast-moving regulation has become a very important thing. And again, I'm not sure how much the new government really gets these things and understands these things, but we will find out over the next few weeks. The budget on the whole was not encouraging for growth and didn't even move the growth needle in the Office of Budget Responsibility forecast.
And possibly the opposite direction.
So now, possibly the opposite direction with too much tax and borrowing. So we shall see over the announcements of the next few weeks whether the government really has a growth strategy. Fast regulation and ensuring the capital is there for growing businesses are two vital components of
Just
that.
to finish off this bit of the conversation, it's so important. There has been a discussion about whether these pension funds being brought together, particularly local authority pension funds, should they be obliged to invest in the UK? Some of that funding.
No, personally, I think it's very difficult to tell people you must invest in that. What if that then goes and makes a loss? So what you can do, though, is make it easier, level the playing field. And how do you do that? Well, you try to make sure instead of having thousands and thousands of little pension funds that can't take a big risk, you do have an amalgamation of, just as they've done in Canada. For instance, and in 20 years, they've grown the Canadian pension plan into a vast, successful, and much more. It has far better returns than British pension funds. So you go for scale, and you don't have so many accounting rules that you disincentivize risk taking. One thing that made a big difference was in the early 2000s, accounting rules that meant companies always had to fill in a pension fund deficit. A totally well-intentioned rule. But the result of that is if you're always going to have to fill in a deficit quickly, rather than let the market play out for some years. Well, then you're very conservative with a small c in your investment strategy, so you never get into a deficit. But then you never get the big returns either. So we must have so many well-intentioned regulations governing pension schemes that they're not empowered to do the best thing for the long term. If you liberate them like that, you don't have to tell them to invest. You don't have to make them invest in British businesses. It will naturally arise.
I just wondered, William, what's your view on assisted dying? Is it time to change the law so that people can take the route of assisted dying?
Well, it's I'm glad I'm not an MP anymore and have to decide on that. I did vote on these sorts of things about 30 years ago when I was always against what we used to call it a different thing, euthanasia, legalized euthanasia, whatever. And I was always against that because I thought it could be abused over time. We haven't had to vote on it for a long time. There's no right or wrong answer. That when you listen to both sides of the argument, you can feel the force of them. I think, though, what I would say on this, if I had to decide, if I was still a member of Parliament, I would think that the case has to be proved. You have to satisfy yourself to change the status quo. You have to really satisfy yourself that is an overwhelming argument. If you're just in the middle, if you're not sure, then actually it's still better to vote against it, to vote against the change, until society is sure it gets it right over a few years. So I would probably it's a bit of fence sitting, but, for genuine reasons of doubt, I'd probably be erring on the side of not voting for it, because I'm not sure. I think it does change society. It does change expectations if you pass this of what happens in old age. It does change the role of doctors and how they're perceived. So I am still, I've got more worries about it. I understand the passion and sadness of people who are strong advocates for it and terrible experiences that their families have been through. But I'm not completely convinced. And if I'm not completely convinced, it's like a jury. If you're not completely convinced, actually, you're not convicting the accused. And if you're not completely convinced in this case, you wouldn't pass the bill. That's my instinct.
We have to talk to you about foreign affairs. You're a former foreign secretary, of course. You were foreign secretary at the time that Russia invaded and then annexed Crimea in 2014. Should the West have done more then? Could they have stopped what has happened subsequently if more had been done back in 2014? We
should have done more. We had quite a debate. I remember going to we were still in the EU, of course, and the Foreign Affairs Council, I and Britain were arguing for stronger sanctions on Russia and tougher measures, and there was the German foreign minister and the Italian foreign minister watering it down. We did end up, of course, with sanctions on Russia, but it was a compromise in the West. And Germany and France were very convinced they could still reach an agreement with Putin about a sustainable peace. It would have been very difficult for us to stop them doing that, to say, no, you're not allowed to try to reach an agreement. So, of course, now, when you look back, then you say, well, of course, the West should have taken a much stronger line at the time. That's now obvious to people in Germany. But we had to work with what we had, with other countries on that. So, but yeah, the lesson of that should not be lost now, which is that we should not go soft on them now. Now that a much bigger war has been launched, and in that context, it's really worrying that President-elect Trump is coming in with what seems to be a pretty strong view that this can be settled quickly, but settled on terms that would overwhelmingly favor Russia if it was just frozen as a conflict now, and would lead to another war, a third war in a couple of years' time when he would come back for the rest. So yeah, we should have been tougher then, and we've got to be resolute now.
You think that Putin wants the whole of Ukraine ultimately?
I think it's very clear. He wants the whole. He wants the whole of Ukraine, or at minimum, he wants so much of it that it cannot function. What would be left of it could not function as a sovereign state. That it could not join the EU, join NATO, that it could not issue the debt that would be needed, raise the money that would be needed to reconstruct its cities. So it really wouldn't be a functioning country. And that is really the issue about this war. It's not necessarily exactly where the border would lie in the end. It is Ukraine able to function as a country at the end of it? And if you just settle the war, if you just say, as seems to be the Trump idea, but we'll see, of course, over the next few weeks, Trump he sometimes does listen to advice, and he can change his opinion quite sharply. But if he proceeds on the basis, well, you have to stop fighting where you are, more or less, well, then that just leaves Ukraine unable to function as a country. Who is going to lend it the money to rebuild those cities? Unless it's in NATO, unless it's or guaranteed by the United States in some way. And how do you stop Putin coming back 2 years later, having rebuilt his armed forces, to grab the rest, or much of the rest? So this is the problem. It can be naive to say, all right, we're going to have peace in 24 hours. But that's no good if you're just building up a future war.
Well, if Trump does go ahead with what you're describing and effectively says to them, we're pulling US support, unless either way, frankly, what should Britain and Europe do in that circumstance?
Well, the first instinct of Britain and Europe should be to continue to give maximum support to Ukraine, to increase that support. But we should be under no illusions that it's not just a matter of financial support. It is technology and military power that matters here. And war has moved on in such a way that without satellites that are owned by American companies and software that is provided by American companies, Ukraine probably could not have survived this far. And that European countries do not possess the arsenals of weaponry to keep Ukraine going in a full-scale modern war. So it will be very difficult, and it will be important to hold out as long as possible, because things can change in the United States, and Trump can change his mind again. So the first instinct should be that, but be under no illusions. Without the United States, it's very difficult, actually, for any democracy under sustained attack in the world to survive without the goodwill and generosity of the United States.
One thing that has really motivated student protests has been the Middle East and Palestine. What's your approach to those who argue that those who have campaigned on what is seen as a pro-Palestinian position are making Jewish students feel uncomfortable, aggressively approached within university campuses? Do you think that those student demonstrations should be cleared from university campuses?
Where they're doing that, yes. I mean, here there are always difficult judgments. Freedom of speech is important in all directions. That includes the freedom of speech to demonstrate against Israel. And to denounce Israeli policy if students or anybody else wish to do so, but not the freedom to intimidate other people or to stop people going about their business, or in the case of something that happened in Oxford, to prevent other people from taking their examinations. That is going too far, and that requires a firm response. But it is, of course, we have freedom of speech and the right to protest in this country, and it is totally understandable that with conflicts raging in the world, people have very strong feelings about it. So express those feelings, but that cannot be frightening other people or preventing them from going about their own legitimate activities.
Do you think a Trump presidency will discourage China over the issue of Taiwan? There's obviously been an awful lot of saber-rattling concern that China may have its eye on Taiwan. Are they less likely to make a move if Trump's president?
No, I don't think less likely. I don't think China is about to invade Taiwan, but I think within the next decade, China is very, very determined to, as they see it, reunify with Taiwan. And what will matter more than who is president is what that president is actually doing in terms of the military posture of the United States, having the capability. The United States having the capability to contest any invasion or blockade, and therefore to deter it. Of course, to the objective here, just as in the Cold War, just as over West Berlin in the days of the Cold War, is to end up not having any fighting, but to deter for the indefinite future any conflict over Taiwan. So that will depend not on, as Donald Trump has said, that Xi Jinping respects him. Hopefully he would respect any president of the United States, but that's not on its own going to be sufficient. It does mean the United States has to be technologically keeping up with or ahead of China, particularly in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, and across the Indo-Pacific region. So that is going to be the key test. Maybe President Trump will do that. But only that, I think, will deter a Taiwan crisis through the next decade.
Just finally, how about a bit of advice for people who are still members of Parliament? You were Foreign Secretary before Donald Trump came to power as the 45th president. He's come now, he's obviously approaching becoming the 47th president of the United States. What advice would you give our Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, who is diametrically opposed to the new president on almost every issue, or in fact, every issue? I can't imagine really there's very much that links them at all in temperament or approach. What would your advice be to Sir Keir Starmer?
It's very difficult. He's been receiving good advice, of course, because despite all those differences with Donald Trump, he has created some sort of relationship. None of us have been the fly on the wall at those meetings. But he's had his dinner. He phoned Trump very quickly after the assassination attempt. That's good advice. That's the right thing to do. And now that has to be kept up because you cannot separate the security of the United Kingdom from the United States. We do not have the option in this country of saying, oh, we don't care anything about the United States. So it's very important that is kept up. But it will be important to have a really frank part of the relationship, which will be saying bluntly, but maybe this is the sort of thing that Trump respects. That, okay, if you put tariffs on everything around the world, if you start putting tariffs on products from the UK, well, then we will have to retaliate. Again, we don't want to have to do that. But the world is going to retaliate, and Britain will do its best to smooth things over for everybody. But it's going to be very rough for you if you do that, and badly affect the UK economy. So I think this is going to be a very difficult mixture for any prime minister, and crucial to influence and persuade Donald Trump over what we've just been talking about over Ukraine. That if he gets this wrong, this will be, Trump highlighted that the humiliation of Biden over Afghanistan and the chaotic withdrawal and abandonment of Afghanistan 3 years ago. But if he ends up with the collapse of Ukraine, that will be a far bigger humiliation for the United States, for the power of the United States in the world, for deterring any future crisis over Taiwan. And it's in Trump's best interests, his own best interests, to maintain the strength of the West on these things. So that's the first argument that Keir Starmer has to win. And I'm not saying that's easy. This will define Keir Starmer, though. This will, it's usually for prime ministers, it's not the thing they were ever planning on that defines their term of office. They come to office with all sorts of good intentions, and they're all going to be about peace and prosperity. And then peace and prosperity gets overtaken by international events. And it's how they then deal with those that becomes the defining posture or moment of their premiership. I think that will be true of Keir Starmer as well.
Lord Hague, William Hague, thank you so much for all your time on the Daily Tea. Good luck in your election, and hopefully you'll return to us victorious.